everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our virtual event space. So my name is Allie, and I'm your host for this evening, and I am so excited to celebrate Bookstore Romance Day with this panel of wonderful romance authors. And of course, with all of you. But before we get into the good stuff, I just want to quickly thank you all so very much for tuning in. As much as we miss having you all in the bookstore, it has been such a delight to expand this online program to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. I will be linking books directly in chat all evening, so it'll be super easy to go find them. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in. All three of our locations are open, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local, we do ship. And once again, we are so grateful for your support. While you are over on our website, I definitely encourage you all to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up in the next few months. And if you'd like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It is a weekly update about events and exciting releases and our online book clubs. And of course, follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. So we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. We would love to hear where you're from or your latest favorite read. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone of our commitment to ensuring the safety and well-being of event attendees and guest authors. So on our chat and question spaces, please do lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. Finally, there are auto-generated closed captions available from the top or bottom of your screen. Select the live transcript button to enable or disable them. And I believe that that is all of my housekeeping. So without further ado, it is time to welcome our panelists. So hold on to your hats, folks, because this is going to be a whirlwind. We're going to go in alphabetical order, starting with New York Times and USA Today bestselling author Gail Carriger, who writes comedies of manners mixed with steampunk and urban fantasy, whose books include the Parasol Protectorate series, among so many others. Next, join me in welcoming Alison Cochran, whose debut Charm Offensive has already charmed third place booksellers. Our resident bookstore romance expert Danielle said it's very much in the running to be her favorite book of the year. Joining us next, we have one of the most commercially successful authors writing today, Jayne Ann Krentz, who has sold over 40 million copies of her more than 50 New York Times bestselling novels under multiple names, including Amanda Quick and Jane Castle. Next, I'm always so happy to welcome our dear friend, aspiring Castle owner, former third place bookseller and award-winning author of numerous books, including most recently The Wonderful Curses, Lish McBride. Joining us next, we have award-winning author Sajni Patel, whose books include the delightful The Trouble with Hating You, and most recently, The Knockout. And finally, moderating the night's festivities, I'm so happy to welcome Olivia Waite, author of the Feminine Pursuit series, who writes historical romance, fantasy, and science fiction. So thank you all so much for being here. I am so excited to listen in on this conversation. If anybody needs anything, of course, give me a shout. I will be listening. This goes for our attendees as well. I will be in the chat. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome, everyone.
All right, folks. The theme of this year's Bookstore Romance Day, which is an event very near and dear to my heart, is cross-genre romance. That is to say, romance that blends mystery or contemporary fiction or historical or paranormal with a romance arc. And this is something that I have loved all my life. I love mixing genres. I love exploring where two genres come together. And so where we'd like to start tonight is I'm going to ask our authors, what is your favorite genre to see combined with romance, either as a reader or a writer? And let's start with Sajni Patel.
Even though I write mainly contemporary romance, I love fantasy romance. I love the bit of danger. Like, you always know there's going to be some danger in there and some action and some magical things happening. And then it's just like a little flower happening when you see some romance blooming. It's like, oh, I think it's just the cherry on top. I love fantasy as it is, but romance, add that to it and it's even better.
Do you have a favorite fantasy romance you can throw out for us?
Oh my gosh, no, I can't think of one on the spot.
All right, Alison, how about you?
Yeah, I also write contemporary romance, but I think lately I've been really into reading like science fiction that blends romance, especially like I'm a queer author, so I love like queers in space. And that is a genre that I'm really enjoying right now. And so I'm always open to more like recommendations for queer space operas or queer space stories.
And Gail Carriger.
That's one of my absolute favorites too. In fact, that's what I wrote down on my little pad. But I'll go with, I guess not really a genre, but a sort of tangential to that because I enjoy both science fiction and fantasy if there is a queer element. But my real candy is also culture conflict. I love any drama, especially if like linguistics are involved, like you have to learn an alien language and the couple can't communicate with each other and they have to learn to yeah, that is total catnip for me. So yeah, I would say any, like for me, any science fiction or fantasy queer romance that has like a social science culture conflict aspect to it is totally in my wheelhouse and I will love it forever. I will also read absolutely anything where a girl cross-dresses as a boy in order to subvert the patriarchy. It's my favorite thing in the universe. So those are my two catnips.
And Lish, how about you?
Mine is so much based on mood. I mean, I like all of it. I mean, I read fantasy, sci-fi, mystery, westerns, whatever with the romance element in it. In fact, I think I've read at least one book by everyone on this panel, which is lovely. But I think I especially love it when it's all mixed together in sort of an unexpected way. The one I read recently that I love so much, and I mix up the title all the time, so Olivia, you'll have to correct me. Is it Paladin's Grace? That's the second one.
Oh, the Kingfisher.
Yeah, the Kingfisher.
Ursula Vernon.
It's like adorable romance, but also kind of like some horror elements, and some severed heads, which are like that shouldn't fit in romance, but it totally does.
Yeah, somehow she makes severed heads very fluffy.
Yeah, it's adorable. Oh, they're stepping on a head. It's so cute. So I think anything that can really become unexpected, but I'll pretty much read anywhere if the author can make it work.
And finally, Jayne Ann Krentz, favorite genre to mix with romance.
I always need a murder. I don't think I've ever been able to plot without a murder. So it would have to be romantic suspense. And I'm happy to do it and read it in any world. I just like that combination, and I've done it in the futuristics, I've done it in the historicals, I've done it in the contemporaries. I do it with a psychic vibe. I just, those two elements together always work for me because the romance heightens the stakes in the mystery, and the mystery heightens the stakes in the romance. So to me, it's its own kind of genre, and it can fit almost anywhere, I think. So.
Do you think there's a genre that's hardest to combine with romance, where they tend to fight each other rather than collaborate? Or do you think it's a question of like expression and approach?
I think you have to ask the readers, because a lot of them have the rules, not us. I mean, I've run into suspense readers and futuristic or science fiction readers who won't touch a book with romance in it. So,
yeah. Alison, how about you? Do you think there's something like there's a really complicated one, or?
Well, I'm really good at suspending my disbelief. So that's part of what I love about reading, is that sense of escape into a world. Like, I want the author to convince me. But because I only write like I don't know what's hardest in my like writing experience. But I love the idea of like trying to add murder, Jayne. So I'm intrigued by that.
it's not that hard, really.
Okay.
No, it's really fun. I actually did this for a work in progress right now, where I was puzzled about how to solve something, and it turned out murder was the answer.
All right.
What was the answer?
Now Lish knows a thing or two about murder as well. Like, she's written some dark and scary YA, and now is writing, well, not dark and scary, like.
No, It was really weird to like, hey, I wrote a book and there's pretty much no one dies, which was weird. There was almost no violence, and it was very, it's a romp, and it was confusing for everybody. For me though, I think like, so I have sort of the opposite problem of the Add a Murder, or not the opposite, but a similar, where I can't write contemporary. I tried because I was like, I'm tired of world building. I want to do this thing, and I was like, turns out I don't know what people do all day. Like I couldn't plot it without magic. So like that one of the projects I'm working on now, I'm like, well, I guess that guy's a werewolf now and she's a witch. Let's see how this goes. And
it is exactly what happened to me. I set out to write a contemporary romance set in the local Bay Area, and it ended up being full of shifters. I was like, oh,
it's impossible. Like
my bad.
What do human people do all day? I don't know, what I'm bad at it. It's like, it's just, that's why, like, I've been reading more contemporary than I used to. I think maybe I'm trying to figure out what they're doing. Like, how does this work?
I'll tell you one thing I can't fit it into, or wouldn't go there and try to fit it into, is what we classify as straight up women's fiction, if you know what I mean. That family drama stuff. I think for me, that would be very difficult to slide at least my kind of romance into it. But I'm not sure even why. I just wouldn't try it.
I think Jayne and I are on polar ends. What Jayne writes, I can't even fathom, like, even to start a plot that way. Oh my gosh, it's so hard. I can't. I have tried, and I failed very miserably. But then I do write women's fiction, and I end up putting romance in it, and it ends up becoming classified as rom-com. So,
is that like a category? Do you think that's become a genre unto itself? Don't you think? The rom-com.
So. Yeah, it's pretty big. Yeah. I don't know how I got here. I just ended up here.
One of the things that you do in your work, Sajni, is you have these really complicated like networks of family. So you have like friend networks that overlap with family networks that overlap with like cultural and religious networks. And so you have all of these connections that you can kind of play off of. So this actually brings up something else I wanted to ask about. And Sajni, if we could start with you. The idea of family dynamics, and either found families or people you're born related to could factor into this. When you start, is there a favorite kind of family dynamic you like to put in your fiction, or that you constantly like wrestle with?
I think I tend to go with found family because I find that it's really hard to make friends. And Lish will tell me, DM me, I'm your friend. What are you talking about? It's really hard for me to make friends, and I do have friends, but they're across the country. So I have always envisioned and fantasized about this, friend group that's really close by, and they will come by at the drop of a hat and eat cheese and drink wine with you and like commiserate about life. So found family is something that, I struggled with in real life to still find. But then regular family, like bloodlines, I guess, they come out a bit more naturally in my writing, because I have such a big family and they're just always in your space and they know everything about you. So it's one of those things. And actually, I just finished writing a book that's a comedic women's fiction, and instead of having a best friend, she has a bro, but it's her guy cousin, which is based off of a real guy cousin. And I love that dynamic, and I feel like my editor actually likes it too. So that's something that I'm really excited about, just have like a female and a male bros, but they're also related.
That sounds really refreshing. That's hard to get in romance. Everybody wants to turn like close platonic relationships into a couple. And it's like, no, sometimes you and your dude cousin are just best friends. That's just how
it's not weird.
Yeah.
Me and my dude cousin are bros. That's fine.
Yeah, he can have his own book. So Alison, you're also writing contemporary, and you had some really interesting family dynamics in your debut. Can you tell us about how you approached that?
Well, I think, like Sajni, I'm more drawn towards found family, and to kind of combat like Gail's concern about like, what do normal people do all day? I like to just like take normal people and put them in like unusual situations. So my debut is about a reality dating show. which means that the characters are pretty cut off for the most part, like from their family of origin, and in a lot of ways end up creating, you know, a kind of a workplace family, if you will, based on love and support. So.
And then Gail, if we're talking about bloodlines, then you've got whole other realms to deal with, because you not only have families and found families, but you have created families in like the werewolves and the vampire hives.
Yeah, I would say everything I write is, well, everything I write until this moment, because you never know what you're going to write in the future, is a found family narrative. And that is because all of my books are either queer or queer allegories. So, and I think, and personally, I devoutly believe, in fact, that an innate part of being queer is finding your family, because most of the time your blood family is not that supportive, at least when I was growing up. So yeah, found family is super, super important to me. And then the sort of dirty little secret of the sort of romance genre with regards to found family is most romances are found family, whether it's finding your one true love soulmate style or not. But what that gives you, if you write in a pack of werewolves or a cast of characters or a small town cozy mystery, is a wide cast of characters, an ensemble cast, if you like, which you can then go write another book about one of those. So from a writerly perspective, having a found family dynamic or a big blood family dynamic that you're writing within, or a werewolf pack or whatever, gives you great meat, and it gives you little side characters that readers get super excited about. And then you can just come along and write the next book in the series that has that side character as a main character, which for many of us, if we come out of other kinds of genre, like say urban fantasy or mystery series or whatever, most readers of those genres expect the series to have the same main character or set of main characters as you go along. But readers of romance are actually incredibly comfortable with this idea that a main character in one series may become a side character in the next series or in the next book, as some other side character gets to be the main character. And I have found over the last 5 or 6 years that that's leaking into other genres now. Now we're getting it in science fiction and fantasy and in mystery. And just from a writerly perspective, being able to kind of essentially write within the same universe, but switch into different POV characters' headspaces, means that we get to both satisfy our readers and keep ourselves entertained with novelty, which is really, really exciting. It's an exciting time to be writing this. And frankly, it's romance that has brought that to the table for many of us.
And Lish, how about you? Because I just finished Curses last week, and the family dynamics in that, like, it was almost like you were setting up the found family versus the blood families, in that a lot of the blood relatives were terrible. Like just flat out terrible, whether they were the hero's relatives or like the villain's relatives.
I mean, I feel like anyone that's known me for any length of time should not find this shocking at all. It's like, I actually, at one point I took one of those like anthropology, like 101 classes in college, and you had to do a family tree, which by the way is a terrible assignment, but you had to include any marriage that your parents had and up to like, it was like to grandparents, and then any kids that had, so basically like I had to color code it and make up symbols. My family is fascinating. I'll just say that. They're lovely. I love them, but we're a little bit all over the map. And so like half my family, I'm not actually related to. They're just kind of like people we've sort of amassed along the way. And it can mean that sometimes introductions are weird. But I think that combined with growing up as kind of a strange kid in a small town, where then you also kind of like go find your people.
Yeah.
I don't think I could write a book that doesn't have that dynamic, because I just don't know what that looks like. Like, I don't know what it looks like to not have built your own secure system. And I think that a lot of writers are kind of coming from that same thing. And so it's a theme in all my books, and I honestly don't think it'll ever stop being a theme. Which I'm fine with. I enjoy it. I love building kind of the wacky friend support system. It's deeply entertaining.
Oh, and you do it so well.
Yay,
So
thank you.
So now, speaking of building systems, I think we should talk about world building a little bit. because it's one of my favorite topics, and I think it's particularly suited to this group of folks, because whether you're writing contemporary or, like as Lish said, contemporary is an act of world building. And like every time she sits down to write, she ends up in a paranormal space. Because contemporary requires like slightly different types of world building, whether you're being really like culturally specific or dealing with known social issues and mental health issues, for instance. So my question for everyone is, do you approach world building, like do you start with the characters and then build the world around them? Or do you start with like kind of the larger view and then like refine as you go? Or do you do something different? And Jayne Ann Krentz, if we could start with you.
Thanks. I think of every book is an act of world building. I don't know how else to describe it. That's what you do, whether it's contemporary or not. Most of the weird stuff I throw in is for my own entertainment, to tell you the truth. It's not, I think world building is something authors do intuitively. It's part of what makes us write, that need to create that universe. And I think we all have a core story, and I think we spend our careers exploring that core story in our own universe, which has lots of places to go. And it's just a function of writing. And I think it goes with what we were talking about earlier, of one way or another, we all create a community around our characters, our main characters, with found family or reuniting with a blood family. You know, it's all about kind of establishing not just that one relationship, but a community that it fits into.
And Alison, how about you?
Yeah, so I feel like usually I start with characters more than world building, but in the case of my debut about a reality dating show, I started with that concept. And so I kind of had to build the world of the reality dating show and what that would look like. And then the characters they were intrinsically like connected to that, but they kind of came secondary to me, being like, I am going to write a queer version of The Bachelor, right? Like that is going to be like what I'm writing about, and then kind of like built in the characters from there. And I think too, like with my book, a reality dating show comes with so much of its own baggage. It has a lot of rules, first of all, in terms of like what the structure is and how it's going to look. But it also, like reality dating shows, the way, or at least most reality dating shows are heteronormative. They're based on like some pretty toxic ideas about gender. Like mental health is often exploited, furthering like stigmatization instead of like, you know, normalizing mental health and mental illness. And so that kind of became the framework like for the book itself.
And Sajni, how do you approach world building?
Well, my characters typically come to me first, and then there's some type of plot that kind of stumbles along. And then as I'm writing, as I'm building the plot, the world sort of forms around it, because my characters need places to go. They need things to do, jobs, things to look at. I have to be visual in my writing. So that's part of where the world building comes from more naturally. And then if I write fantasy, because I did just write a fantasy manuscript, I get to just kind of explode and do whatever I want and go on a power trip, because I'm creating whatever I want in this world. It doesn't have to make sense with physics. Like, you know, I can't really explain it to you scientifically, but I can create this entire world where there's giant monsters and things that grow upside down and whatever. So that's really fun to do. But in either case, the character always comes first, and it's just, what are they going to be surrounded with? Who are they going to be surrounded with? What is their daily life? And, you know, whatever the plot is, whatever they're trying to move toward, that's my world building process. It's maybe doesn't make sense, but it does in my head.
Can you tell us like some things a little bit more about the fantasy that you're working on?
Oh, yes. My dark fantasy. My dark fantasy that my agent kept saying, add a little bit more romance. I was like, no, there's no romance. I refuse to put romance in this, but there is some romance in there now. It's a retelling of Medusa, but with Indian mythology. and showing the way that a woman has been villainized when she's been the victim, and how the patriarchy looks at her. And then all around her, I can just create things that she's able to control, like specifically giant monsters. But then I have to make sure, I think, and this is how it is with world building for any world or any book that you're writing, it has to be consistent. It has to make sense. There has to be some type of system behind it, whether you're going to explain it in the book or not. There has to be that system so that it's a concrete world.
So that actually reminds me of something that Gail Carriger was saying, which is she was talking about queer metaphors, and you were talking about Medusa and this idea of somebody becoming monstrous through a trauma that has happened to them, which is kind of tied into the whole Medusa storyline. And so I just wanted to open up the floor and talk about monsters, both real and metaphorical, because we have a lot of people who deal with either people with supernatural powers or people who are partially monsters, or actual humans who are just monstrous because they're terrible, or who worry that they're monsters for various reasons. Do you think there's something particularly compelling about this idea of monsters being redeemed, or of people turning into monsters?
Yes.
I mean, well, yes.
You know, I put like a shapeshifter in like anything that I write, right? So like, yes. For me though, I love things to be unexpected, and we have the way we grow up, most people, you're fed, the monster is the bad guy, and I love it when it's flipped. And usually my humans are the bad guy, and the crazier or creepier the thing is, like the sweeter or funnier. It's like I like it to be that. I like it to be like the bar scene in Tangled. If you've seen that, I've had to watch a lot of cartoons. I have children, but like I wouldn't watch it if I didn't have children. I'd still watch cartoons. The scene where she goes in and everyone just looks really villainous and terrible, and you think this is a seedy bar, something bad's gonna happen, and they like burst into song and they talk about all these things that they love, and there are things that are not what we would put with them stereotypically. And that's basically like the sweet spot I always like to hit with the books. I like it to have that character that looks one way, but then does something unexpected. So my beast character for Curses is not a terrible person. Like they're not, doing anything awful or even that rude. It's just kind of, she disobeyed her mother, and it's sort of through happenstance got her cursed. Whereas the people that are truly monstrous in the book are beautiful, and they're just horrible people. And so like I like to sort of mix and match with my monsters.
And Gail, I know in your world, in the Parasol Protectorate series, like there's actually a trauma associated becoming with a vampire or a werewolf. There's an injury. It's almost like, it is.
Yeah, I intentionally write my vampires and werewolves as queer coded, and also there's canonized bisexuality to my main characters, like family line and that sort of thing. And that's intentional, and that's partly because I come out of social science studies. So what I look at literary has to do with kind of the impact that literature has had on society, and also vice versa. And I've always been very interested in the dawn of genre fiction, specifically the genre fiction that comes out of the Gothic literary movement of the Victorian era for Western readers, and that has a history of vilification of queerdom within the guise of monstrosity. And very good examples of that are something like The Monk, but pretty much Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, any of these early things, and we can see it in cinematic pop culture as well. Particularly vilification of feminized gay masculinity, beta gay masculinity, and of course the opposite, which you often see in fairy tales, which is strong female vilification in terms of over-sexualization, the witch, all of those sorts of things. And that's very kind of endemic to the early or the mid Romantic Gothic literary movement, which was also the literature that was most read by women, which gave birth to eventually, among other things, the romance genre, which is still most read by women. And because it was sensationalized and vilified by male critics at the time, what we've been battling with for 200 years is a continued vilification of the kinds of books that I like to write and the kinds of books that I like to read, i.e. those that are written by and targeted at the female readership mostly, under which queer has kind of come in the last 20 or 30 years in a big way. And so like this idea of monstrosity as in a way representing liminality, particularly a liminality of a brain that thinks differently, or the creative mindset, or the hyper intelligent mindset, that is a scary thing for the mainstream, whatever that mainstream cultural narrative is something that I find very exciting and interesting, and also very easy to tackle with a romantic narrative and with a comedic narrative, which is what I primarily write comedies of manners, which allows me to be very critical and subversive of whatever culture I'm in, because they're all parodies. And so for me, like, picking up and playing with the monster is like not really an option, because the monster is always something that in a way represents both who I am and what I read, as well as the birth of the genres that I love. And so it's gonna be this thing that I'm always having a conversation with. And most commonly for me, it's in putting them into positions of liminality. So my supernatural creatures, for example, are always bridges between, alter realities, alter worlds, creative minds. Like, for example, the werewolves and vampires in my Victorian London recruit specifically from the arts. So they have actors and opera singers and painters and other performers as part of their hives and packs, specifically to eventually turn them into vampires and werewolves. And that is both fantastically fun to write, because I have a bunch of overdramatic artists freaking out all the time, surrounded by monsters trying to like keep their food sources under control, but also like take care of their babies and their loved ones. So it's a vehicle for comedy, but it's also me having this like whole dialogue about what happens within cultures to these subversive side elements that exist in all cultures, that represent both what it means to be queer, but also what it means to be someone who's in touch with the gray space of that we all inhabit as artists.
Well, speaking of publishing history, we have on this panel an immense breadth of what I'm going to call like authorial generations. I mean, on the one hand, we have Jayne Ann Krentz, who I read so many of your books growing up.
Don't go there.
And then we have people who debuted in the past year and two with like in the middle of a global pandemic, which is definitely like, this is not a normal book release year, you guys. Like this has been absolutely a roller coaster. So I want to kind of explore like just kind of this range that we have. And Jayne Ann Krentz, I noticed that you just reissued a book that first came out in 1985. Can you tell us, like, did you make alterations? What's the biggest change in the industry since then? Like, that's a huge amount of time.
The ability to self-publish. I mean, that's the biggest change. That was the one thing that if that had been available when I started out, I would definitely have pursued that, and it just wasn't. It wasn't in the cards. It wasn't available physically. And I think the biggest change is actually, and I'm viewing this primarily from my perspective as a romance genre writer, was because romance always kind of went under the radar as far as the critics were concerned. Come Valentine's Day, they do a parody of romance writers, or some kind of joke about romance writers. Basically, they ignored us. And that turned out to be a really nice thing, a really good thing for writers. Because we were allowed, when I look back, we were allowed to do so much experimentation, and we still do, that I don't think you could have gotten away with in some of the other genres like mystery, which are more hidebound in terms of the conventions and the tropes. But in romance, nobody paid attention in a sense, so the experiments started early and continue to this day. And I would say that's why I probably would never, I don't see myself ever leaving the romance genre, because there's plenty of room in it. It's just so much room in it.
And then speaking of which, like the pivots that you've had to do over the course of, you've gone from like paranormal to historical to contemporary to paranormal mystery again to like, you've written British set and you've written American set. Like,
I changed the worlds just because I enjoy different settings.
and that's
And it's turned out to be very, given the length of my career, it's turned out to be, it was a very good choice or a very good decision early on to use different landscapes because it keeps me fresh. It keeps the stories fresh for me. And as we all know, if it's not fresh for the writer, it's not going to work for the reader. So that the pivoting is strictly something I do for fun and try to find a place for it in the market.
so then how has for Gail and Lish, you've been writing paranormal, like in the paranormal space for quite a while. Like, I'm not sure about the exact years. I looked up the one with Jayne Ann Krentz, I admit, but like what are the changes that you've seen just in like paranormal romance and urban fantasy, just like over the course of your time as an author?
Well, I wrote down one word on the tiny little notepad that I have here, which was ebooks. That was so my first book came out right as the ebook kind of revolution, such as it is, was beginning, and that was a game changer. And again, I think it has to do with romance, because I remember my publisher coming to me and saying in a very hushed and shocked tone that they were amazed at how many ebook sales I had for my first book, and they were like, "You're 25% of your sales are ebooks," and they had just never had an author like that before. They'd never seen an author do that before. And I turned around and looked at them and said, "Do you think that's because it's being read by romance readers?" Because romance readers were the first major adopters of ebooks amongst everything else. And I agree that, like, if you want to know where the industry is headed and what's going on, it's romance almost always leads the charge in that regard. They're always trying, like, technologically trying new things, as well as within the pages itself. And I am personally an ebook reader almost exclusively now. Like, I made that transition partly because my publisher put me on tour for 6 years solid, like 2 releases a tour, 12 cities in 13 days, and suddenly I can't take a bunch of books with me. I took an ebook reader with me, and now I'm never going to go back. But so for me, that was it. The ebook revolution was huge. And then absolutely the self-publishing and hybrid revolution. Yeah. Because it gave us an opportunity to be as experimental as we wanted to be as authors. Like, if the traditional publisher doesn't want it, we can write it and publish it anyway. And we've just never had that option before.
And it's not just the question of, like, printing it and distributing it to a few friends. You can get it like on a major platform with a click of a couple of buttons. And it may not look quite as pretty as some of the professionally formatted ones, but it'll get the job done.
I would just like to say here, speaking as my role as a former librarian, there are no ex-librarians. It's sort of like the Marines, But I would just like to say that when I look back at the years in the library, if you checked out an audiobook, you were strongly suspected of not being able to read a real book.
Mm-hmm.
That attitude toward audiobooks, as we all know, has totally gone away. Now, so many writers or so many readers I know will buy it in multiple formats. They buy the hard copy, they'll buy the audio, and they'll buy the ebook version too. It's surprisingly common to acquire books in multiple formats. And I find that really interesting. But when I look back at the library days, it makes perfect sense. That was the rise of audio, and it's the formats. I guess what surprised me the most was that so many people will read multiple formats. And I think that's really interesting. And that's the way it's settling out. Because each one is a different experience.
Don't forget the illustrated edition and the hardcover edition and the companion coloring book and the companion cookbook. And look, and just as I was just going to show you an example of being like honest hybrid, which is these books are in the same series. This one is produced by my publisher and this one is produced by me. It's pretty easy these days to make it quite seamless.
Well, and I think that's because in some ways, we have an idea that the readership is there sometimes before the publisher does. where we know like that it's, especially, I mean, with romance, it's such a voracious and connected readership. Like I came up, and I'm still in, you know, young adult, and like young adult has a pretty big range. A lot of people read it, but even I was surprised, like how quickly like news and everything else and book recommendations travels through romance. Like it was, you know, fascinating to me, like that, how kind of on it that community is. And so I think both Gail and Jayne are right that like you can, if you want to see like where things are going, see what they're adapting. Because I'm as a reader, I'm so hybrid now with like I have audio, I have a really lovely e-reader, and then books. And so if it's a favorite of mine, sometimes I end up with like not just the fancy editions, but also like
Just all the
maybe I have it on ebook. Because I mean, what if I need to read it and I'm not home? Or like an audiobook, because maybe they have a really lovely narrator, and just it's a bit of a problem. I don't know whether I should be proud or ashamed. So I'm gonna go with proud, but like the amount of reading apps, and it's ridiculous at this point, that are on my phone and everything. But I love it. I love that it does open up, I think, all that experimentation, because I think the similarity between young adult and romance readerships is if you can pull it off, they'll get into it. There's in so many other genres I've run into, the readers will be like, well, I don't like that kind of book, I'm not going to look at it. And for me, especially if I'm reading, I'm like, well, it's not my favorite thing, but I want to see what the author's doing. And if they can pull it off, then I'll read it. Like I'll be like, well, I was wrong. I'm in. And I think that those two readerships especially will be like, well, okay, you know, that's a bold move. Let's see what you do. And it's one of the things I really love about it, because otherwise I would get bored.
Yeah, no, romance is very rarely boring.
No.
Like the big book yesterday that everybody was talking about and recommending is about minotaur milking.
I'm sorry, I apparently was offline yesterday. What was this?
Like somebody's like, oh my gosh, you guys, the minotaur milking book is adorable. And we're like, hang on, I know all of those words, what they mean, but what do they mean when they're next to each other? Like, and it's like, and romance readers are like, well, I gotta see what that's about. You know, like it's like the, you know, basic contemporary fiction is doing a very basic gymnastics floor routine, and romance is like, no, I'm gonna do like a I'm gonna do a Simone Biles type routine backwards and in heels. Watch this. And everybody's like, yeah, I'd like to see her pull that off.
Romance readers are like, well, it's minotaur milking. Okay, but is it a fake relationship trope? And is there only one bed?
Yes.
That's what romance readers are like. Because then minotaur milking, I'm all about it. Like, but there must be a fake, you know, there are certainly tropes that romance readers will read for. It's just not the tropes that other readers read.
Can help you if you injure a pet. Like,
well, I specialize in that, actually. Having come out of science fiction and fantasy, I believe that you should kill the yappy dog and witness whatever is yapping on this Zoom call right now. But you will. I never kill characters. I only kill pets. But don't worry, I make them very evil pets first. And usually the werewolves just eat them and get indigestion.
And that, again, that feels fluffy in a weird way. Like.
Yeah.
All right, so we're at the point where we should start looking at our Q&A. We have one question in the Q&A, and it's honestly, it's a little exciting because I have never seen anybody ask this before. So we have talked about how romance series often involve a rotating cast of characters, but as romance writers, do you ever have the urge to explore main characters with more than one romantic arc? Often I think readers expect a happily ever after with the first partner they're introduced to, but that's not necessarily reflective of real life. And this is interesting because it's layered, and I can immediately think all the way back to Bertress Small and the Skye O'Malley saga, which she did have, like, I forget how many husbands, like 7 or 8 over the course of the series, because, you know, they kept dying, but each one was the love of her life, and then they would die, and then the love of her life. And I think one of them died and then came back. It was bonkers, Phil.
There were some like Celtic historicals, and then there's like the Thornbird style of like multi-generational, or Antonia's Line or something like that, where you get, you know, so the first husband dies and then there's another one that comes along, or the first husband is the Celtic warrior and the second one is a Roman warrior and the third one is a druid or whatever, right? So it is possible. I'll answer the question really quickly, which is I have not, because I genuinely like the traditional trope of romance, which is 2 or more people who end up happily together at the end. But I have fans and readers who are clamoring for two extremely popular characters. Alessandro, who's a heritage character, he's like mentioned in the background, he's an anti-hero and he dies tragically. People really want me to write about him. And I'm like, yes, but he's an anti-hero and he dies tragically. And then I also have a character that everybody knows. She gets married. She's one of my spy characters. She gets married and he dies because it's a plot point in future books. And then she ends up with a woman in later books. And so I would have to write, and it's sad. She loves her first love very much. So I would have to write, if I wrote her story, it would have to have tragic elements. And I just, like, personally as a writer, I've shied away from it because I don't wanna. And that's not to say I won't, but like right now, I'm still personally very married to the journey of finding your person. Or persons. That's very kind of like satisfying to me. And like I said, I don't like killing people. So yeah, but it has been recommended. I think, however, that largely has to do with the fact that my reader base comes out of science fiction and fantasy and not primarily romance. I have a lot of romance readers, and the stuff that I have specifically marketed to the romance market, I would never do that with. But my original series was shelved in either YA or sci-fi fantasy mostly. And so I think those readers are more excited to get amorphous endings and more okay with that. Than perhaps a traditional romance reader might be.
And Sajni and Alison, thoughts on this, or?
For my type of writing, I wouldn't be able to, just because it's the whole arc is completed in one book, and the characters just go well with each other. And I've actually never thought about it. Yeah, it is realistic to have more than one love of your life or more than one husband or wife, or but no, I've actually never thought about it. I think if I were to write something that was a series and it could be built up across multiple books, that would work, but I don't foresee myself doing that.
Yeah, and contemporary readers in romance really, it's happily ever after or happy for now, but romance readers expect happily ever after in contemporary romance. So I think it would be difficult to pull that off for a lot of readers. And like Sajni said, like a lot of times that romantic arc is tied to like the emotional arc of the characters. And so they really, like, over the course of the story, have that self-actualization. They grow in whatever way they needed to over the course of the story. And often their arc is kind of done for that particular book.
Well, there is a long tradition of widows and widowers finding this second love of their life in the romance genre. So it's not like it doesn't happen, but I personally speaking, the reason I've never been able to establish a long-running series with the same two characters is because I always leave them in a good place, and I don't want to go back and break up the relationship again and mess it up and have to fix it again. It's like I'd rather work with new characters.
And for me,
I was just going to ask if I'm the only one who's written a longer running series with the same main characters.
Lish has.
Okay, so Lish has as well. Okay.
And yeah.
For me too, I think there's, what I hear with what everyone says. But it's also that idea, it's sort of like, it's not that these characters have never dated anyone before or are coming fresh out of the box. Like that's not generally realistic, but we're focusing on the relationship that was important. It's sort of like, the sort of joke with young adult where everyone's like, why are we following the one like teen wizard who's going to save the world? And it's like, well, because that's the story that's important and the one we want to focus on. The kid that's just kind of like not saving the world, while exciting, is maybe not what we want to see. And this is the same sort of thing, but with a relationship where it's like, they dated all those other people, but that went poorly. And so or it's over now. And usually for good reasons. It's why like the second chance romance is a harder sell for me. Because I'm like, usually things end for a real good reason. And I don't
want to do a lot of work in that one.
Yeah. And so I'm like, I'll read it, but it's like, it's gonna be a hard sell, friend. Yeah.
Oh, I love them when they're good. Like Farah Roshan's Cherish Me is an absolute masterpiece. Like,
I have to say, oh, sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say urban fantasy does do this. And I'm thinking about Charlene Harris's True Blood, whatever the
Andrews
book.
does this, but it's not separate couples. It's like a multi-book arc for a single couple.
Yeah, and that's one of genre conventions of urban fantasy is that you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to have a badass, generally female main character who has multiple relationships through the course of a very long arc. I mean, we could probably blame Laurel K. Hamilton or some of the earlier,
Oh, I'm comfortable.
let's blame her. So it does. I mean, I think if you play correctly to the genre expectations and you can control your audience's expectations and you don't break their suspension of disbelief, you can do all of these things, but you probably wouldn't be able to build that book or series as primarily romance. You would have to choose a different genre initially, and you would have to code that with your blurb and your cover and everything else, which presumably if you're with a traditional publisher, they know how to do that. And then you could probably have multiple, I mean, space opera does this, political epic fantasy does this kind of thing a lot too. I'm thinking about one of my favorites of all time, which is the Servant of the Empire series by Jenny Worth and Raymond Feast. And she has two very solid romantic relationships, one of which ends in divorce, and then, her other one returns from possibly a different, fantasy world and then magically returns to her. So it is both like a second chance and a reunion and, like a divorce, and she still loves the other person. So it's almost poly in the end. But that's a political epic fantasy. So, different genre conventions, but I still consider it very romantic.
Yeah.
It's just that main character got two romances.
The Corsican series has this happen. Like there's multiple romance arcs. And his mother has a couple as well. Like, not to spoil the last book, but look, it's been out like 5 years. We're fine. All right. We have another question in the app. Are we at the point where we want to switch back to the bookstore and tell everybody where to find us? Is that a good moment to do that?
How about one more question?
One more question. All right. For historical romance writers, how do you feel about enhancing historical situations for the sake of inclusion? I love a Victorian romp, says Calandra, but it can be hard to find historicals with diverse people. And we can give you Rex for that, by the way. I think many readers are picking up romance in hopes of escaping everyday life and love to see their identities represented. And I'm actually—
Well, you can make it fantastical. But I have to say, history is a lot more diverse than anybody gives it credit for. And I've just put my archaeologist hat on for a second, and I'll take it back off again. But also, I think there's a misjudgment on the part of some authors about what the readers of historical romance as a genre convention are actually looking for. And I think one of the things that a lot of historical readers are looking for is the mannerism of history, is the difference of it, is the escapist of it, almost like an alt fantasy world, but is the sort of layered and somewhat rigid nature of morality and conventions and society in whatever alt history you're writing in. Frankly, I think this is why people really love Korean dramas right now, particularly the romance genres, is there's also this sort of layered manneristic kind of control over particularly aspects of physical touch that you can see in some of the best Austen films. This idea that like the buildup is to just the hands touching, like, and the like diversity of your cast has nothing to do with those conventions, quite frankly. And so, I think it's just some writers sort of misread what it is that readers of the genre really want. I think, that's just kind of learning. I feel like there's a difference between a writer eye and a reader eye, and readers are frankly usually quite terrible at saying what they like about a book. And it's kind of our responsibility to really figure out what they like about a book. And I think learning what people like about historical romance, I'm a big fan of historical romance. And that's because I like the alt reality of it. And I like seeing people subvert and break with the expectations of that historical society, which is what Austen wrote. I mean, that's what her books are about. How a smart, capable woman from the middle class can break into the upper class. And we can totally keep writing that with diverse characters.
Well, and there's especially in the past few years, there's been definitely a push to get more inclusive historical romance on bookshelves, like specifically. It's been really exciting. There's queer romances, there's Vanessa Riley, you've got, like, it used to be so hard to find servant characters in romance, and now it's like, I can think of like 4 or 5 people off the bat where people are writing working class characters or serving class characters. Rose Lerner has a book called, I think it's Listen to the Moon is the title, and it's a butler and a maid who are out of work, and they get married so that they can go find jobs together in a household, because the household won't hire them unless they're a couple. So they get married for the job's sake, and then they end up falling in love while they're, you know, doing all of the serving things. They're scrubbing pots and she's sweeping floors, and like, and it's beautiful and it's escapist and it's romantic, but it's not like all rich people problems, but it does feel like it's this alternate world. This small town in Regency England very much matters, and the stakes there are very real. And it's, yeah, so I think there's been a push to kind of open things up. You've got Cat Sebastian's queer romances happening. You've got like all of the indie space with 1950s trans poly triads being published now. And like, yeah, it's been a really exciting couple of years for specifically this kind of thing in historical romance. And I know that contemporary romance is starting to get there as well, especially pushed by the hunger for inclusion that we're seeing in YA spaces. All right, so we are at 1 minute till. If readers are looking to find you, where is the best place to go? And let's go alphabetical order. So we're starting with Gail.
Sorry. You can find me at gailcarriger.com. That's Gail spelled the British way, G-A-I-L, Carriger, C-A-R-R-I-G-E-R. But I'm pretty good on my SEO, so you can just Google that and everything will come up. I'm on all the social media platforms, but my website is the best way to connect with me. And I also have an enormous resources list. So if you go over to, if you're on my website, there's a tab with a drop down that's the About tab, and under that is resources. So there are resources for newer writers, that sort of a thing. But also I tend to do I'm a voracious reader, so I do a lot of recommendations as well. So yeah, you can go find my various lists of sci-fi queer romances or comedic, found family queer written by Black authors. Like, I just come up with a list and I'll just post it up on my website. So yeah, you can go find it all there.
All right, Alison.
You can find me at AlisonCochran.com, which is a great way to connect with me. I'm on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is the best way. I'm far more active on Instagram because Twitter is horrifying. So if you want to connect with me, Instagram is what I would recommend.
Jayne Ann Krentz.
Same here, JayneAnnKrentz.com. Also on Facebook and Instagram.
Lish.
Sorry, the dog is going crazy. LishMcBride.com. So it's my name. If you put in Lish, I mean, you're either going to get me or Gordon Lish, and I think you can suss it out pretty quickly. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter. I think I'm still on Facebook. I'm really bad about posting on there, but mostly Instagram because, like Alison said, Twitter is, I love it, but also I hate it.
And Sajni Patel.
So you can find my website at sajnipatel.com. I'm on Twitter at Sajni Patel Books, but I'm mainly on Instagram because Instagram is my safe, happy place as far as social media goes. Also at Sajni Patel Books.
And I'm Olivia Waite. You can find me at oliviawaite.com. I am still on Twitter. God help my soul. I'm also on Instagram as @ohwowwait, which is very fun. I'm never on Facebook. And I have a newsletter at tinyletter.com/Olivia Waite. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm going to hand it back to Allie with third place.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. So it is about time that we call it a night, but I'm just going to take this last second to say a huge, huge thank you to all of you for being here. It has been such a delight. To all of our audience members, thank you so much for spending this evening with us. It was so great to have you here. And a special thank you to those of you who came in to celebrate Indie Books or Bookstore Romance Day in the store. Whew, got there in the end. In the store. Thank you, thank you, thank you. For those of you who would like to get copies of any of the books that have come up today, go ahead and scroll up for links. At this point, we've had a lot of chatting, so take your second to scroll up and track down those links to those books. Of course, you can come on in and grab copies if you are local. If not, you know where to find those links. Let us know, of course, what you thought of this event, either in person or in any of our social media. We are at Their Place Books one more time. And we always love to hear from you. Authors, one more huge thank you. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your love and knowledge of this genre. We love it too, and this was so great. And I think that this is where we say goodnight. Shall we let the awkward waving begin?
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.